And welcome back. So let's start jumping into variances. We're going to have price and quantity variances. We're going to have variations from our flexible budgets based on what expectations were. So we're going to go ahead and do some more analysis and see what we're after here. So our goal is to take a look at our variable cost, our fixed costs, and the variable costs being made up of direct material, direct labor, and variable overhead. And so we're going to be analyzing variances. And why do we have variances? Well, we have a flexible budget. We know about that. We budgeted based on certain levels of production, levels of our operations, but the actual cost may vary from what we had as our standard costs. And our quantities and rates both may vary. So we're going to have two types of variance we need to isolate. We're going to have to isolate our price variance and our quantity variance. When it comes to material, price of the materials, that's going to be the price variance. And the quantity is going to be obviously the amount of materials used in the production. Let's say we're selling beef and we budgeted $3 a pound for a heifer, for whatever beef was coming in, and we end up paying $3.25 a pound. That's an unfavorable variance. The price per pound is more. But what happens if it was a better quality beef and it yielded better results and there was less waste? So if we went through that, we might have a favorable quantity variance. We use less meat to produce whatever we're making, but we have an unfavorable price variance. If we look at labor, we can do the same thing. Our dollar per hour of the labor cost might be higher or lower, but then the number of hours used to produce whatever we're using or producing rather could be higher or lower as well. So that's why we have to isolate those and determine for materials, price variance and a quantity variance for materials, a rate and efficiency variance. Again, it's the same as price and quantity for labor. And then we have a spending and efficiency on the variable overhead side. We do not usually include fixed overhead in the variance because fixed costs aren't going to change within that relevant range we've talked about in the past. So we're looking at that relevant range. We're saying fixed price will be pretty constant. But we can get variations in our materials, our labor, and our overhead. So standard price, standard quantity. The standard price is how much should be paid based on what our expectations are. And the standard quantity is the amount allowed for 1 unit of product. So that's what the finished good productions will be. So then we have favorable and unfavorable. Okay, and favorable when actual is less than the standard. So we spent less money, we use less materials. Unfavorable is when actual is greater than standard, higher price or higher quantity of units needed to produce the materials. So we have our direct materials quantity variance. Fewer units. Again, the company used fewer units of input of materials. That would be favorable. And if we actually use more input, then that would be unfavorable. If we went back to our example, this time we used the leather from the cow to make furniture. If we got some real high quality leather that actually cost us a little bit more, that price variance might be unfavorable, but the quantity variance, we're probably going to be more efficient. We're going to be able to use more of the hide, and it's going to be more favorable along those lines. So what we have a material price variance and a material quantity variance that make up the total. Notice at the top of this chart, we have actual cost, actual quantity times actual price. And then we have our flexible budget cost, which is our standard quantity times standard price. And now we'll get a variation. That's the total. That's the big picture. But now we need to break that down into subsets. And there are 2 subsets we look at. One's based on material price variance. One's based on the materials quantity variance. In this case, our price variance is unfavorable, meaning we paid more than we thought per unit. But our quantity variable is favorable because we use less stuff to make it. Our material variance, direct, here's an example. Employee responsible for purchasing materials paid 15 cents more per yard than the standard. So that's a 15-cent difference times 980 yards. We have 147 unfavorable variance. We actually spent more, $147 more on the materials. But the quantity of materials, we used 40 yards less. So 980 instead of 1020. That sounds favorable, and it is, because we actually were able to produce the same number of units using a lesser quantity. So we had 120 favorable dollar variance on the quantity variance, a negative or unfavorable $147 on the price variance. So that nets out to an unfavorable $27. If we just looked at the budget and we looked at the actual cost, we would see it would come out to $27. But having the separation of a materials price variance and a materials quantity variance gives us a more detailed understanding of where the shortcoming or where the unfavorable and the favorable elements are. So we might have some causes of material price variance. Volume discounts, so we get it cheaper. Effective bargaining and negotiation. Or we bought some materials that were a little less than what we wanted in terms of quality, so we were able to pay a little bit less. Or we bought from a distressed seller, fire sale. On the other hand, unfavorable, we weren't able to get enough quantities to get the volume discounts, or there was a timing issue that we had to pay extra shipping to get it here faster. Maybe we didn't have the negotiations and we didn't bargain real well, or the market price changes that is beyond our control, and that was unfavorable. The cost of oil, the cost of plastic, the cost of whatever materials we're using, copper, lithium, or we're purchasing higher quality materials than specified. So we may be getting a higher level of quality, but the actual price to go with that is a higher cost for that quality. And then we have quantity variances, less materials waste than allowed by the standard, better machinery efficiency. So there's some outside forces that can play. Direct materials of higher quality than required, or we're more efficient and we're getting better at it. Incurring more waste was allowed in the standard, poorly maintained machinery, larger amounts of raw materials of lower quality, or poorly trained employees would result in unfavorable. So that's on the material side. Let's take a look at the labor side. And we have the same idea. We have cost variances actual and standard variances associated with a flexible budget is what our standards are, and the actual cost is what we actually paid, the rate and the number of hours. Those are the two things that usually go in. And so we have a labor rate variance. So that's based on the hourly rate, and a labor efficiency variance. How efficient were our laborers in producing the goods? Did they take more time or less time, more hours or less? In this case, we had a $13 favorable rate variance. We were paying $11.90 instead of $12, but we had an inefficiency where our efficiency variance, we actually paid more, or we used more labor hours than we thought we would. And that netted out to an unfavorable $17. And then we look at that here, we're looking and saying, okay, we paid 10 cents an hour less, but we used more hours than allowed by the standard for the 850. So we're unfavorable here, but we paid less here by 10 cents an hour. So we're favorable on the labor rate variance. And why do those come into play? Well, we might have less skilled employees at a lower pay rate. Okay, so that's natural. We're going to pay a lower wage associated, or reduction in the wage rates since the standards were developed. So maybe standards were developed at different rates, and we have maybe less costly people because we have some more automation and we don't need a skilled labor force to execute and do whatever needs to be done. Rate variance, more highly skilled or experienced employees, they get paid more typically than the standard, and increased wage rates since the standards were developed. So maybe the standards did change. And then we have our efficiency. We have favorable efficiency variance, our highly skilled workers that we're paying them more, but that they've been around longer. They've done this before. What takes a newbie 2 hours took them an hour and a half. Maybe there's better machinery. Maybe the raw materials were higher quality than the standards provide, so there was less waste and less inefficiencies. High employee morale. Happy employees tend to work better, improve job satisfaction, improve working conditions, better lighting, better environment, temperature, people, whatever it might be. On the unfavorable side, maybe poorly trained workers, poorly maintained machinery, or downtime where we couldn't use the machines and we wasted time. Low morale and poor working conditions kick into gear. So that's where we start looking at our variances for materials, variances for labor. Now let's take a look at variance for overhead. So our overhead cost variance, you recall that we had a standard rate and then we had our actual overhead. We actually washed out that difference into cost of goods sold. That was part of the formulation of when we were analyzing that. So variable overhead, that's why we were using that ABC, activity-based costing, because it was more efficient in estimating total overhead. I'm sorry, in estimating overhead associated with different product lines, where we had the single standard rate. So with standards are more difficult to set, so we are based on a standard. So the overhead rate represents groups of different costs, and there's no natural physical measure like labor hours or materials or pound or whatever it might be. So we use a substitute measure of quantity. In this case is the single, not activity-based costing, but a single variable overhead rate based maybe on machine hours, direct labor hours, or possibly direct labor dollars. And we're also going to have a spending variance and an efficiency variance with our overhead as well. So we may be using different quantities, and if we use labor hours, if we use other measurements, we're going to have the actual cost, flexible budget cost, and then we're going to have the difference in between. And again, we're analyzing, in this case, we had two unfavorable variances. We had an overhead efficiency variance and overhead spending variance, both negative or unfavorable. So combine the 40 and the 41 made for an $81 total unfavorable variance associated. Okay. And variable overhead variances include many heterogeneous costs. So there's multiple inputs affecting the cost. And we have different expenditures that go with that. Then we have our fixed overhead variance, okay? Because a fixed overhead budget is the same for all output levels within a relevant range. The budget variance is not broken into price and quantity factors. We mentioned that we weren't taking that into account earlier when we talked about fixed price and quantity factors or fixed cost variances. But we might have paid higher salaries on some of those, what we thought were fixed costs, or maintenance costs exceeded budget. So that concludes this module 23, talking about our variances. And we'll have some problems and examples of problems that we do a deeper dive, and we're having actual costs times actual quantities and standard costs by standard quantities. And then we're going to factor in and break that down into multiple levels. I look forward to seeing you again soon. That concludes this module, and we will go ahead and get ready for our final module for the semester for next week. Thank you for your time.